He picked up the menu and held it in front of his face like a shield, watching them over the top of it. He was being absurd. He knew he was being absurd. He was Nam Joo, CEO of JH Group, one of the most powerful men in South Korea's corporate landscape, sitting in a restaurant, spying on his secretary's dinner date like a jealous teenager. If anyone who knew him saw this, he would never recover. But he could not leave. He watched as Chucks, her fiancé, reached across the table and covered Laura's hand with his, and Nam Joo's jaw tightened so hard he felt it in his neck. He watched Laura tilt her head back and laugh at something her fiancé said, and the sound of it carried faintly across the restaurant, low and warm and unguarded. The kind of laugh he had never once heard from her in the 8 years that she worked for him, and it did something to him that he was completely unprepared for. 2 hours ago, the envelopes landed on his desk with a soft thud. Nam Joo looked up from his laptop, his expression carved from stone as always, and stared at the 2 white envelopes his secretary had just placed in front of him. Laura, 8 years of watching her walk into his office every morning with a cup of coffee she prepared herself, and a quiet dignity that he had never once acknowledged out loud. 8 years of her anticipating his every need before he even voiced it. 8 years of her being the one constant in his life that was built around chaos, deals, and power. She was the perfect secretary. And now she stood before him, hands closed in front of her and her dark eyes steady and unreadable, waiting for him to open the envelopes. He picked it and opened the first one. The words resignation letter sat at the top of the page in clean, formal font, and beneath it, a full month's notice, a professional thank you, and her signature. Laura Adiz Okonkwo. He had never seen her full name written out like that before. It hit him somewhere strange. He set it down. He opened the second envelope. A wedding invitation. Cream cardstock with gold lettering. The names printed at the center of the card were Laura Adiz Okonkwo and Emeka Chucks Nwasu. The date was 4 weeks away. Nam Joo did not move for a very long time. The silence in the office stretched and thinned until it was almost unbearable. He was aware of the clock on the wall ticking. He was aware of Laura still standing there, not fidgeting, not apologizing, not filling the silence the way most people would have. That had always been one of the things about her. She was never afraid of silence or him. She had always been able to hold her ground in it. There was always something about her. He placed both documents side by side on the desk. Then he looked at her. "Explain this," he said. "I believe both documents are self-explanatory, sir," Laura said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. "You're getting married." "Yes." "And leaving. We'll be relocating to Nigeria after the wedding. Chucks has business interests there, and my family is there." It made sense. Nam Joo said nothing. He turned his chair slightly to face the window, and for a moment he just stared out at the city. Inside his chest, something was happening that he didn't have language for. He was a man who had built his empire on the ability to identify and name things quickly, risks, opportunities, weaknesses, threats. He could read a room in seconds. He could predict market shifts before analysts confirmed them. He could look at a man across a boardroom table and know exactly what he wanted and exactly how to use it. But whatever was happening inside him right now had no name. It was rage, yes, the kind of cold, controlled fury that he was well acquainted with. But it was also something else, something that sat beneath the rage like a second floor he hadn't known existed, something that felt uncomfortably close to panic. He turned back to face her. "How long?" he asked. "Sir, how long have you been engaged?" Laura blinked. "About 7 months. 7 months. 7 months, and he had not known. 7 months of her walking into this office, handling his calls, rescheduling his meetings, anticipating the temperature of his coffee, sitting across from him in briefings, and he had not noticed that something in her life had fundamentally changed. He had not noticed because he had never looked. Not really. Not at her as a person. She had simply always been there, as reliably as the lights in the ceiling, and he had taken her the same way, for granted, without examination. The realization was not comfortable. "How is it that I didn't know?" he asked. She was his employee, not his family. She owed him no disclosure of her personal life. He knew that, yet he couldn't stop wondering how. But Laura met his gaze without flinching. "With respect, sir," she said quietly, "you've never asked. You've always treated me the same way you treat every member of your staff, professionally, efficiently. I didn't think my personal life would be of any interest to you." The words were delivered without malice. That was almost worse. She wasn't angry with him. She wasn't hurt. She was simply stating facts, the way a person states the color of a wall or the temperature of a room. She genuinely, completely, had not expected him to care. And why would she? He had never given her reason to think otherwise. Something moved through Nam Joo that he refused to call what it was. 8 years, he said finally, standing up from his chair and walking slowly around the desk. He didn't approach her. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, and looked at her the way he should have looked at her a long time ago. 8 years of your life, and you're just going to close the door on all of it like that. "That's not how I see it," Laura said. She held his gaze steady. "Those 8 years were important to me. I gave this company everything I had. But sir, all my friends are married now. My parents have been asking me for years. I'm not getting any younger, and I've been so consumed by this job that I've put my own life on hold for long enough. It's time. I deserve to have my own life." Nam Joo felt the stab of that somewhere deep. She had put her life on hold. Because of this job. Because of him, because his schedule had become her schedule. His world had consumed hers. And he had never once looked up from the edge of his own ambitions long enough to see the cost it was extracting from the person keeping everything running for him. He looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then, very quietly, he asked the one question he had no business asking. "Do you actually love him?" Laura's lips parted. Something passed across her face, quick, complex, gone almost before he could identify it. She looked at him for just a second too long, and then she looked down at her watch. "I have a date tonight," she said. "I'd like to leave a little early if that's all right." He almost said no. The word was right there. A single syllable. He was her boss. He could have buried it in reasonableness. "There's still the Hong Kong file. There are the morning briefings to prepare. I need you to go through the CO contract before tomorrow." There were 1,000 professional-sounding reasons he could have reached for. But underneath, every single one of them was a man who simply, desperately, did not want her to walk out that door and into the arms of someone who had put a ring on her finger without him ever knowing it happened. "Go," he said. She nodded, professional and composed, and she turned and walked toward the door. He watched her pick up her coat from the rack near the entrance, watched her slip into it with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, and watched the door close softly behind her. Then Nam Joo stood alone in his enormous office, with 2 pieces of paper on his desk and a feeling in his chest like something tearing slowly, and he stared at the door for a long time. Then he reached for his jacket. He told himself he was being rational. He told himself that a man in his position had every right to understand the circumstances of losing a key member of his executive team. He told himself that following her was a business decision, essentially, that he needed to assess the situation with his own eyes before he could form a plan. He told himself these things all the way down in the elevator, across the lobby, and into the back of his waiting car. He told his driver to follow her taxi. He was lying to himself, and some part of him knew it. If you're enjoying this story already, and you're eager to know what happens next, if Nam Joo will be able to let his secretary go, if he would cause a disaster, or if Laura will have a change of heart, please like this video. Support this channel by subscribing and comment where you're watching from so we can welcome you. Now back to the story. The restaurant Laura went to was warm and low-lit, the kind of place designed for intimacy. Nam Joo walked in 4 minutes after her, wearing his coat collar turned up, and he requested a seat far from the couple already settling into their booth near the window. The hostess recognized him. People usually did, because he was famous for his ruthlessness in business and his attractiveness too. but he silenced her with a look and a single raised finger. She showed him to a table that was close to the couple but far enough that they wouldn't notice him. Then she gave him a menu and disappeared. He didn't open the menu. He looked across the restaurant at Laura. She had taken her hair down. He hadn't seen her hair down before. It fell around her shoulders, and in the warm light of the restaurant, she looked entirely different from the composed, efficient woman who had stood in his office an hour ago. She looked softer. She looked lovely. The man across from her was the fiancé. Nam Joo looked at him with cold, analytical eyes. Chuck's Nwasu was, by any objective measure, a good-looking man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy confidence in the way he leaned back in his chair. Well-dressed. The watch on his wrist was expensive. He was laughing at something, showing good teeth, and Laura was smiling back at him. Something violent moved through Nam Joo. He picked up the menu and held it in front of his face like a shield, watching them over the top of it. He was being absurd. He knew he was being absurd. He was Nam Joo, CEO of JH Group, one of the most powerful men in South Korea's corporate landscape, sitting in a restaurant, spying on his secretary's dinner date like a jealous teenager. If anyone who knew him saw this, he would never recover. But he could not leave. He watched as Chuck's, her fiancé, reached across the table and covered Laura's hand with his, and Nam Joo's jaw tightened so hard he felt it in his neck. He watched Laura tilt her head back and laugh at something her fiancé said, and the sound of it carried faintly across the restaurant, low and warm and unguarded. The kind of laugh he had never once heard from her in 8 years, and it did something to him that he was completely unprepared for. He had given her nothing to laugh about. In 8 years, he had never made her laugh like that. He had never made her feel comfortable enough to laugh like that. He had been demanding and cold and efficient and relentless, and she had matched every single thing he threw at her without complaint, and he had called that a good working relationship and never examined it further. He set the menu down. He watched Chuck's touch her hand again. He watched Laura smile at him. He thought about that question he had asked in the office. Do you actually love him? And the way she had deflected it. He thought about the 7 months of an engagement he had known nothing about. He thought about 8 years of her sitting 3 offices down from him, keeping his life running, and he had never once thought to ask if her life was running too. What was wrong with him? He was on the verge of standing up and leaving. He had decided, firmly, that he would go, that this was insane, that she was a grown woman who had made her choices, and he had no right to any of this, when Laura stood up from the table. She said something to Chuck's with a small smile, gestured toward the back of the restaurant, and headed for the restrooms. Chuck's reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Nam Joo wasn't going to watch. He was genuinely about to stand up and leave. He had made the decision. He pushed his chair back slightly, reached for his coat on the adjacent chair. And then he heard it. Not loud, just clear enough. The restaurant noise had dipped in that particular way it sometimes does. "Hey, babe," Chuck said over the phone. Then he laughed. A low, warm laugh, entirely different from the laugh he'd been performing at the table moments ago. "Laura, we're getting married next week. But don't worry, she's nothing. You know it's you I actually love, right? Why don't we sort out a time tonight, after I leave here, that hotel we always go to?" Namju stopped moving. He sat very still for exactly 3 seconds. The coat was still in his hands. The restaurant noise came back up around him, conversations and cutlery and low music, and he sat inside all of it like a man standing in the eye of something enormous. Then he stood up. He crossed the restaurant with hard stomps, and before Chuck's had time to register that anyone was approaching, Nam Joo's fist connected with the side of his face with a force that sent the phone skidding across the floor and knocked the man backward off his chair. The table rocked. Glasses shook. The restaurant went abruptly, completely silent. Nam Joo stood over him, breathing hard, his expression completely controlled except for his eyes. "What?" Chuck scrambled, half on the floor, one hand flying to his face. "Who are you and what is your problem?" "Namju." Laura's voice hit him like cold water. He turned. She had stopped a few feet away, staring at the scene, at her fiancé on the floor holding his jaw, at her boss standing over him in a designer coat with his fist still clenched, her expression shifting rapidly from shock to fury. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, and then her voice climbed. "What did you do?" "Laura," he stepped toward her. "Listen to me. He was on the phone with another woman. He was planning to meet her tonight after dinner with you," he said. "Stop." She was already moving past him, crouching beside Chuck's, one hand on his arm helping him up. "Stop talking." "Laura, I heard him with my own." "You followed me." Her voice was shaking now, not with hurt but with something hot and controlled. She helped Chuck's to his feet, and the man leaned into her with an expression that shifted quickly from pain to calculated sympathy, the performance of a man who knew exactly how to work the moment. "You followed me from work. You showed up at my private dinner, and now you're attacking my fiancé and expecting me to believe some story you invented too." "I didn't invent anything." "Why are you here, Nam Joo?" She finally looked at him fully. Her eyes were bright with emotion. "Is it because you realized you can't function without someone running your entire life for you? Because you're so incapable of dealing with someone leaving that you'd rather destroy what they're leaving for?" She shook her head. "This is selfish. This is the most selfish thing I've ever seen you do, and that is saying something." He opened his mouth. He closed it. She was already walking out, one hand supporting Chuck's, her back straight and her head high, not looking back. The restaurant was still watching. Nam Joo stood in the middle of it, alone, and he did not try to stop her. He should have stopped her. He said nothing. He stood there for a long time after they left, the sounds of the restaurant returning slowly around him, and then he walked out into the night. The next day, Laura did not come to work. He noticed the moment he arrived and found his office quiet in the particular way it was only when she was absent. Her desk outside his door was empty. No coffee waiting. No morning briefing notes aligned with his schedule. No quiet knock at 9 o'clock with the day's agenda. Just silence and the faint discomfort of a man who had run his professional life through another person for 8 years and was now abruptly confronted with the infrastructure of his own dependency. He didn't call her. He told himself it was because she needed space. He told himself it was because the situation required delicacy. He sat through 3 meetings that should have required her briefing notes, which he did not have, and he got through all 3 on memory and instinct, the way he had before her, back when he was younger and less organized and the company was smaller. He could manage without her. Of course he could. But at 4 in the afternoon, sitting in an empty conference room long after everyone else had filtered out, he admitted to himself that managing without her and wanting to manage without her were 2 entirely different things. She was going to marry Chuck's. He knew what he had heard. He knew with absolute certainty what that phone call had been, and he knew that Laura, somewhere across the city tonight, was making wedding arrangements with a man who planned to spend the night with another woman after their engagement dinner. And he had tried to tell her. He had tried, and she had looked at him across that restaurant with all the distrust 8 years of being treated as a function rather than a person had earned him, and she had walked away. He deserved that. He didn't deserve her. But Chuck's deserved her even less, and that was the part he couldn't let go of. She was absent the second day as well. And the third day, Nam Joo, who had not slept properly in 3 nights, who had sat through 11 meetings and signed 14 documents and made 6 international calls, and done all of it with the competent, mechanical efficiency of someone performing a function, while the real part of them was elsewhere. Nam Joo got into his car and told his driver an address. He had pulled her HR file. He wasn't proud of it. Her apartment building was in a quieter part of the city, mid-range, clean, the kind of place chosen by someone who was practical with money and had learned not to expect luxury to be provided. He took the elevator to her floor. He stood in front of her door for a moment, adjusted his tie, and knocked. The silence on the other side lasted long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then the door opened. Laura looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately classify. She was in comfortable clothes, no makeup, hair pulled up, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping well either. For a moment she simply stared at him, and he understood that he was, in the context of her regular life, a completely improbable figure standing in her doorway. Her boss, Nam Joo, at her apartment, on a Tuesday morning. "Sir," she said. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for the restaurant, for showing up like that and for what happened. I handled it badly." She stared at him. He waited. "You're apologizing," she said, as if verifying the translation in her head. "Yes." "You," she pointed at him slightly. "Nam Joo, you are apologizing." "I'm aware of how it sounds." She was quiet for another moment, and then something shifted in her face, not warmth exactly, but the wall came down by one brick, and she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Her apartment was tidy in the particular way of someone who had been sitting inside their own head for several days. The tidiness of distraction, of someone who had cleaned things not because they needed to be cleaned, but because their hands needed to be doing something. She made him tea. He sat at her small kitchen table and watched her move around her kitchen, and he thought about all the mornings he had arrived at his office and simply expected everything to be in order. The coffee, the schedule, the files, the dozens of small and large mechanics that kept his professional life running, and how he had attributed all of it to an efficient system rather than to the specific person who had built and maintained that system every single day. She set the tea in front of him and sat across from him with her own cup. "How are the wedding preparations?" he asked. Her hands tightened slightly around the cup. "Fine," she said. He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I'd like to give you a wedding gift," he said. "But first, I want to take you out. As a proper acknowledgement of 8 years of exceptional work. I've never done that. I should have long ago, and I didn't. Will you let me?" She studied him across the table with eyes that were old enough in their knowledge of him to be looking for the angle. He let her look. "Just that," she said. "Just that," he said. She agreed, in the way a person agrees to something they're not fully certain about but are too tired and too worn down and perhaps too curious to refuse. She went to get changed, and he waited in her kitchen and drank the tea and tried to be honest with himself about what he was doing. He was not being selfless, he knew that. He was buying time. He was giving himself the chance he had not taken in 8 years, the chance to show her that he saw her, that he was capable of seeing her, that whatever version of him had existed for the last 8 years, cold, indifferent, relentless, impossible, was not the only version. He wanted her to see one evening of what it would look like if he had been paying attention. He wanted that, and he was ashamed of how much he wanted it, and he did it anyway. He led her to the car and opened the door for her. She paused, looked at the open door, looked at him. He held the door and waited. She got in. He took her to a salon first. Not just any salon, the kind that required a waiting list weeks in advance, the kind that Laura had mentioned, once, in passing, nearly 2 years ago in a throwaway conversation he had apparently filed somewhere in the back of his mind without meaning to. She had been looking at something on her phone, and she had said, mostly to herself, that she'd always wanted to try the Brazilian blowout they did at that place. He hadn't responded. He had already been reading the next document, but the name of the salon had, apparently, lodged itself somewhere it could be retrieved. Laura's expression when he named the salon told him everything. The flash of pure, unguarded delight, quickly suppressed, quickly returned to composure, but there. He had seen it. She came out an hour and a half later with her hair falling in a way that made him need a moment to find something else to look at. It wasn't that she looked different. She looked like herself, just the version of herself that had never been given the space to come forward in all the time they had worked together. He took her to pick out a dress after that. She protested. He was quietly and completely immovable. She chose something after much deliberation, a deep burgundy dress that she held up with the expression of someone handling a thing they love and are not sure they're entitled to. And he told the attendant they'd take it, and he watched Laura disappear into the fitting room. She came out in the dress and the new hair, and he stood very still in the middle of the boutique and looked at her. "How do I look?" she asked. She was asking in the practical way of someone who wanted an accurate answer, not a flattering one. Better than you've ever looked, he said, and he meant it without any calculation whatsoever, which was new for him. You should wear your hair like this more often. Laura's eyes did something complex and unreadable. Chuck's always said the ponytail was fine, she said, and she said it lightly, but he heard what was underneath it. He said nothing. He offered her his arm to lead her out of the boutique, and after a beat, she took it. The restaurant he chose was elegant but not intimidating. The kind of place where the lighting was designed to make people feel like the best version of themselves, where the spaces between tables were wide enough for real conversation, where everything on the menu was genuinely excellent. He had booked it 3 hours ago, and the reservation had been arranged in the time it took most people to return a single email, because that was the particular and not insignificant advantage of being who he was. They were seated. Menus appeared. Champagne arrived without being ordered. Laura looked across the table at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the look of a woman who was genuinely uncertain what to do with what was happening to her, who had built up very clear and specific walls around what she expected from him, and was finding those walls behaving strangely. He asked her about Nigeria. She talked about Lagos, the chaos and the life of it, the family she missed, her mother's cooking, the way the city moved. He asked questions, real ones. She answered, and as the meal progressed, she relaxed by degrees, and he watched it happen and felt something in his own chest that he couldn't look at directly, like trying to look at something bright. She was laughing at something he said. He heard the sound of it up close for the first time, and it was different from across a restaurant, different from watching it directed at someone else. It landed differently. He was aware that he was running out of time. He looked toward the restaurant entrance. Then his phone vibrated. The message from his man was short, confirmed, arriving in 8 minutes. He looked at Laura, who was describing something with her hands, animated in a way he had never once seen her in the office, and he felt the particular weight of what he was about to do to her evening settle over him. He hadn't wanted to do it this way. He had spent 3 days wishing he could find a cleaner, gentler way. But there wasn't one. The wedding was 3 weeks away. There was no time for gentle. He kept his expression easy and kept asking questions, and she kept talking, and then he saw, from the corner of his eye, the restaurant door open. Chucks walked in. He was not alone. The woman beside him was tall, Korean, laughing at something Chucks was saying as they followed the hostess to their table. Chucks had his hand on the small of her back with the easy, proprietary comfort of someone very familiar with the territory. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't even trying to. He had no reason to believe he had any reason to. Laura's voice stopped. Nam Joo watched it happen. He watched the moment she registered the figure moving through the restaurant, watched her eyes track across the room with the reflexive attention of someone who had caught something in their peripheral vision, watched the recognition arrive, watched it curdle immediately into something that went far deeper than surprise. Chucks and the woman sat down. The woman said something. Chucks laughed, leaned across the table, and kissed her. Fully. With the ease of a man who was completely comfortable in a public restaurant, kissing a woman who was not his fiancée while his fiancée sat 30 feet away in a burgundy dress he had never once offered to buy for her. Laura turned back to Namju. Her face was very still in the way that faces are still, when what they're feeling is too enormous to let through all at once. Did you know? It wasn't quite a question. He held her gaze. Yes. You brought me here for this. I had my people track him. I knew he'd be here tonight. He kept his voice level, not apologizing for what he'd done but not performing righteousness either. I tried to tell you in the restaurant. You didn't believe me. I needed you to see it yourself. She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were flat on the table. The champagne glass was still half full. The food they had ordered was still arriving in stages. I'd like to leave, she said. All right, he said. He didn't look at Chucks as they walked out. He didn't need to. He caught only the moment that Chucks looked up from his table and saw them walking toward the exit, saw Laura's back and the dress and the hair, and saw Nam Joo's hand move briefly to the small of her back as they reached the door, a touch, a guiding gesture, automatic and gone in a second, and he saw Chuck's go very still. They got into the car. Nam Joo told the driver to give them a moment, and the driver stepped out. The car was quiet. Laura was looking straight ahead through the windshield at nothing, and she was very still, and then she was not still anymore. It came up slowly, the way things do when they've been held down long enough, a shudder in her shoulders, a breath that cracked in the middle, and then she was crying. Not dramatically, not collapsing, just sitting in his car with her hands folded in her lap and tears moving down her face quietly, like something draining. He didn't say anything. He reached out slowly and put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. He moved closer and he put his arms around her and she let him. Her head came down against his shoulder and she cried. And he held her, and he kept his arms steady and didn't try to talk her through it or rush her out of it. He simply held her and let her feel it completely. After a while, the crying slowed. She didn't pull away immediately. She stayed against his shoulder for another moment, and he was aware of the specific and complete silence of the car around them, and the warmth of her, and the fact that he had held her like this before, 3 days ago, in a restaurant, after a very different catastrophe, and that it had felt, both times, like the most natural and most overdue thing he had ever done. She finally sat back. She found a tissue in her clutch and pressed it carefully under her eyes. She looked composed again, or working toward it, the pieces reassembling in real time. "Why did you follow me that night?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. He had been waiting for this question. He had not prepared an answer, because he had decided, somewhere in the 3 sleepless nights, that he was done preparing answers when it came to her. He had been performing and calculating and managing his image for 8 years while she stood 3 offices away, and he had never told her anything true. "Because I couldn't let you leave," he said. "I told myself it was professional, that I needed to assess the situation, but that wasn't it." He looked at her. "The moment I saw those envelopes on my desk, something happened that I didn't understand, and I'm not accustomed to things I don't understand, so I followed you to figure it out." He paused. "Watching you in that restaurant with him, I couldn't name what I was feeling, but I knew I didn't want to leave, and when I heard what he said on that phone, I stopped thinking entirely." Laura was watching him. "I have feelings for you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, directly, without ornamentation, as if softening it would diminish its accuracy. "I don't know exactly when that started, or how long it's been true. I think it may have been longer than I'm able to clearly see right now. But I know that the idea of you marrying someone and moving to another country was not something I could sit with. And I know that I would have done what I did in that restaurant again, given the same information, because I would rather you were angry at me and safe than comfortable and deceived." He stopped. "That's why I followed you." Lara looked at him for a long time. "You never looked at me," she said finally. "In 8 years, you never actually looked at me." "I know. I would have been visible to you if you'd looked." "I know that too." She turned back to the windshield. She was quiet again, but it was different from the silence in his office, different even from the silence of a few minutes ago. This was a thinking silence. "He's going to call me tonight," she said. "Acting like nothing happened, that's who he is." "Probably," Namju said. "My parents are going to be devastated." She pressed her lips together. "They love the idea of this marriage. My mother's already bought her a soa-by fabric." "I know. I'll have to tell them, and his parents." A pause. "They need to know why." Nam Joo looked at his phone. He pulled up a photograph, clear, taken at close range by one of his men from a table nearby, timestamp visible. Chuck's and the woman, midway through the kiss, unmistakable. He handed the phone to Laura. She looked at it for a long time. "How many do you have?" she asked quietly. "Enough," he said. "As many as you need." She handed the phone back without saying anything more. He forwarded the relevant images to her phone without asking, because she would need them, and she needed not to have to ask for them. She looked at the notification when it arrived, opened it briefly, and then put her phone in her clutch. "Take me home, please," she said. He knocked on the partition and the driver returned. They drove through the city, mostly quiet. She sat beside him and looked out at Seoul moving past the windows, lit and indifferent and enormous. And he sat beside her and did not push and did not rush and did not, for once in his professional life, try to manage the outcome. She handled it exactly as he had expected her to, which was to say, completely and with precision. She called Chuck's that night and told him she knew. She did not yell. She told him what she had seen and that she had the photograph and that the engagement was over. Chuck's attempted denial, then minimization, then a version of apology that she apparently found insufficient, because when the call ended, it ended finally. She called her parents. That one was harder. Nam Joo knew it had been hard because she told him afterward, not in detail, just the broad shape of it, her mother's crying, her father's measured silence, the particular weight of disappointing people who wanted something for you that you now couldn't give them. He listened. He didn't offer solutions or perspective. He just listened, and when she had said what she needed to say, he asked if she needed anything else from him. She said no, and she said it in a way that meant not tonight. The photograph reached both families by the end of the week, forwarded by Laura with a straightforwardness that he quietly respected. Chuck's Enwasu did not contest it. The engagement was formally dissolved. Laura came back to work. She appeared on Monday morning, the way she always had, composed, competent, carrying his schedule under one arm and her coffee in her other hand, in her usual clothes with her hair in its usual ponytail. He watched her from the doorway of his office as she settled into her desk, and then she looked up and saw him watching, and something moved between them that had not been there 8 days ago. He went back to his desk. At 2:00, he walked out to her desk and stood across from her. She looked up at him, waiting. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. Not as an apology and not as a thank you and not as a professional acknowledgement, as a first date. He held her gaze. "I'm asking you on a date, Laura." Her expression shifted through several things in quick succession. He watched each one. "At the moment," she said carefully, "I have just ended a 7-month engagement, and I am technically still your employee, and there are a number of reasons why this is complicated." "I'm aware," he said. "And you have spent 8 years being, in your own words, indifferent to my existence." "That's accurate." "And you expect me to just—" "I'm not expecting anything," he said. "I'm asking, there's a difference." She looked at him across the desk. He stood quietly and let himself be looked at, which was not something he usually permitted, and she took her time, which he had expected. "Dinner," she said finally. "Dinner," he confirmed. "And we'll talk." "We'll talk." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she looked down at his schedule, open on her desk. "You're free Thursday evening," she said. "I know," he said. "I left it open." She looked up again quickly. He had left it open. He had looked at his calendar 3 days ago and blocked Thursday evening and told his assistant, the secondary one, the one who handled things Laura didn't, that he was unavailable. He had done it on the same morning he had decided to stop managing outcomes and start making decisions. He had done it because he was, at his core, a man who identified what he wanted and then moved toward it. And it had taken him 8 years and 2 white envelopes and a restaurant and a terrible week of absence to identify clearly what it was that he wanted. He wanted her. Not her labor, not her efficiency, not the system she had built and the function she performed and the decade of her competence. He wanted Laura, the woman who held her ground in silence, who had not been afraid to hand him a resignation and a wedding invitation on the same evening, who had cried quietly in his car and pulled herself back together and made every hard call she needed to make with the same steadiness she brought to everything. She looked at his calendar. She looked at Thursday. "Thursday," she said. He nodded once and went back into his office. What happened after that Thursday dinner was not a simple story, and it was not a fast one. It was dinners that stretched past midnight and conversations that surprised them both and an adjustment that required, on both sides, the conscious dismantling of 8 years of the professional distance they had built between themselves. It was Laura telling him plainly, over a meal 6 weeks later, that she needed to know he was capable of actually seeing her, not managing her, not incorporating her into his system, actually seeing her as a person, and him saying, just as plainly, that he understood and that he was working on it. It was working on it. It was the hair salon appointment he booked for her on the 3rd month because he had remembered, again, something she had said in passing, and her expression when she arrived and realized he had organized it without being asked. It was the laughter, which came more easily now, and the arguments, which were also easier than he had expected, because she argued back without apologizing for it, and he argued back without cruelty, and they found, in that back and forth, a kind of honesty that was better than the polished deference of their professional relationship had ever been. He looked at her sometimes, across a restaurant table or in the passenger seat of his car, or simply across the office when the door was open and she didn't know he was watching, and he thought about 2 white envelopes on a desk and the feeling he had not been able to name. He could name it now. He had been afraid of losing her before he even knew he wanted to keep her. That was what had lived under the rage that night, the fear of a man who had spent so long being indifferent to something essential that, by the time he recognized its value, it was already walking out the door. He had not let her walk out the door, and she had not left. That was not a small thing. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This story is for everyone who has ever been visible to the wrong people and invisible to the one who should have been paying attention all along, and for everyone who stayed long enough for the right people to finally look up.
Hi, I'm Sam, and I hope you enjoyed the story. Please support by subscribing, commenting what you enjoyed about this story and where you're watching from. Ciao!